The story of the British Empire begins not with grand palaces or sweeping conquests, but with salt-sprayed decks and daring maritime ambition. In the late 1500s and early 1600s, England was a relatively modest kingdom compared to the sprawling empires of Spain and Portugal, which dominated global trade and colonization. Driven by rivalry, economic hunger, and a sense of national pride, English merchants, explorers, and privateers began charting new routes, establishing outposts, and dreaming of empire. The foundation came in 1600 with the formation of the British East India Company, what would evolve into one of the most powerful corporate entities in human history. A few years later, in 1607, Jamestown was founded in North America, marking the birth of England's colonial era. These early settlements and trading companies set a precedent. The British Empire would grow not only through conquest, but through commerce, diplomacy, and corporate influence. By the 17th century, Britain had expanded into the Caribbean, North America, and the coasts of West Africa, driven by lucrative trades in sugar, tobacco, slaves, and textiles. The transatlantic slave trade, in which Britain played a central role, became one of the darkest engines of empire. Millions of African lives were forcibly uprooted and brutally exploited to fuel plantation economies in British colonies. This trade enriched Britain's elite and funded imperial expansion, laying the economic foundations of empire at immense human cost. British ports like Liverpool, Bristol, and London became bustling hubs of colonial commerce. Ships would sail out with goods, return laden with riches, and Britain's reputation as a seafaring power grew. The 18th century marked the rise of Britain as a truly global empire. As rival powers waned, most notably France, after losing ground in North America, Britain emerged dominant in trade and naval strength. The defeat of Napoleon in 1815 left Britain with unrivaled global influence. Its territories stretched across the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. The British Navy became the most powerful in the world, enabling not just military conquest, but the enforcement of trade routes, diplomatic leverage, and the protection of colonies far from home. The empire became more than a collection of trading posts. It was an integrated system of governance, culture, and control. From Canada to Calcutta, Gibraltar to the Cape of Good Hope, British rule was stamped on administrative buildings, railways, legal codes, and currency. At the heart of this expansion was India, the crown jewel of the empire. The British East India Company had grown from a trade facilitator into a governing power, controlling vast regions of India through diplomacy, warfare, and treaties. Following the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the British government officially took control, and Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India. British officials, soldiers, and civil servants flooded the subcontinent, reshaping its economy, infrastructure, and society. Railways, telegraphs, and irrigation systems were introduced, but so were exploitative tax structures, famine-inducing agricultural policies, and racial hierarchies. While British influence was often presented as modernisation, it also suppressed local industries and traditions. India's economic strength, once based on textiles and artisanal crafts, was redirected to serve imperial profit. Simultaneously, British expansion surged across Africa. The late 19th century saw a frantic race for territory, known as the Scramble for Africa. Fueled by industrial competition and a belief in European superiority, Britain seized control of regions from Egypt to South Africa, Nigeria to Kenya. British explorers carved borders, mapped lands, and established protectorates. These new colonies supplied rubber, gold, coffee, cocoa, and labour, while being subjected to military control and cultural erasure. Missionary schools imposed Western education, while resistance movements were violently suppressed. Though imperial propaganda spoke of bringing civilization, the lived reality for millions was one of disenfranchisement, displacement, and exploitation. By the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire stood unmatched in scope. Nearly a quarter of the globe's landmass and population were under British rule. This era, often called the High Empire, was marked by immense pride and prestige. British citizens saw themselves as stewards of progress. Writers like Rudyard Kipling promoted the white man's burden, while the empire's imagery filled children's textbooks, newspapers, and coins. Steamships carried British culture to distant ports. Cricket, parliamentary government, and English language were exported globally. Cities like Delhi, Lagos, and Singapore were reshaped with colonial architecture and institutions. But beneath this gloss lay growing unrest. Local populations, intellectuals, and reformers began to resist imperial control. World War I tested the empire's cohesion. British colonies contributed soldiers, resources, and manpower, reinforcing their importance, but also igniting demands for autonomy. Indian troops fought valiantly in Europe and the Middle East, and by war's end, nationalists expected concessions. In Ireland, rebellion erupted, leading to the creation of the Irish Free State in 1922. Egypt too pushed for independence. Though Britain emerged victorious, the cracks in the imperial foundation were widening. World War II accelerated this decline. Britain suffered enormous losses and economic strain. Its global holdings became vulnerable, and its reliance on colonial troops and support highlighted how deeply entwined the empire had become, but also how unsustainable. After the war, the United States and Soviet Union rose as superpowers. Britain was no longer the central force in world politics. The independence of India in 1947, after years of non-violent protests led by Mahatma Gandhi and widespread civil disobedience, marked a turning point. The jewel in the crown had broken away. Partition scarred the region with mass migrations and violence, but the imperial structure had irrevocably shifted. Decolonization spread rapidly. Over the next 3 decades, dozens of nations across Africa, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific achieved independence. Ghana, Kenya, Malaysia, Jamaica, Trinidad, and many others formed their own governments, shaking off colonial rule. Some transitions were peaceful, while others were marred by violence, insurgencies, and civil war. Britain negotiated, resisted, and sometimes reluctantly released control. The empire's final significant chapter came in 1997 with the handover of Hong Kong to China, a symbolic gesture marking the end of formal imperial authority. Yet the end of political control did not erase the British Empire's global footprint. English remains a dominant language, used in commerce, diplomacy, and media. Legal systems, educational structures, and political institutions in former colonies often bear British hallmarks. The Commonwealth of Nations, an organisation of 56 countries, many of them former colonies, continues to link nations through shared history, sport, and diplomacy. Britain itself grapples with post-colonial identity. Debates about immigration, national pride, cultural heritage, and historical accountability remain prominent. Statues, museums, and curricula reflect ongoing tensions about how empire is remembered and interpreted. The British Empire rose through ambition and maritime mastery, grew with industrial muscle and global conquest, and ended with moral reckoning and the unstoppable tide of independence. It was a story of power and paradox, a force that built infrastructure and institutions but also enforced hierarchy and injustice. Today, its legacy invites reflection. From bustling cities and remote villages shaped by its influence, to cultures that resisted and overcame it, the empire lives on not as a political entity, but as a shared historical experience. Understanding its rise and fall is not just about empires, it's about people, ideas, and the long shadow of history.